Hi guys, it's me Shazza HD and welcome to tonight this qualifying preview for the second Grand Prix of the season, the Chinese Grand Prix. And there is plenty to go through in this qualifying preview. Of course, there already has been a sprint qualifying session. We'll go through all the data from that session to see how that will affect things, probably going forward for qualifying. And I also will touch on the sprint race and the grid we've got for the sprint race. Yeah, I'll touch on that and just give my thoughts as to what should happen with that sprint. And of course, with qualifying coming up tomorrow morning, yeah, obviously starting there with the quick few moments of silence for Eddie Jordan, who sadly yesterday, I think morning, passed away. And yeah, very sad. Obviously, he's been such a big part of Formula One since the very early 1990s, and even since 20 years ago was the last year of the Jordan Formula One team. He continued his presence in Formula One as a pundit for quite a while and was highly, highly successful at that. Him part of that BBC F1 crew with David Coulthard, Jake Humphrey, Mike Brundle, all them. Those days were absolutely fantastic, and he continued to be a great pundit. Once that team was broken up, and then into the Channel 4 days, had a great podcast going as well lately with David Coulthard, and yeah, just so sad to lose him. I think the biggest tribute I can give to Eddie is just, praising him for mainly the Formula One career he had as a team boss. The job he did with that team was absolutely brilliant. Obviously, they were a very good junior team, I think, in Formula 3000 in the late 80s, early 90s. Then they came to Formula One. First 2 to 3 years, they were okay. And then from about 94 until 2001, I would say they were regularly very competitive in the midfield, the upper midfield, and even getting quite a few podiums and, of course, some quite famous race victories as well. Um, and especially if you look at the results of the Jordan team from, say, 95 until, say, 99, what he was doing with that team was quite incredible. Competing with teams and sometimes in some races and even in the championship, beating teams who had more money and more resources behind them. For example, in the year 1999, obviously they could have claimed for Heinz Howard Frentzen the Drivers' Championship. Maybe in another universe that could have happened. They did come close with that, but ended up beating Williams in the championship, a Williams team who had only just a couple years before been winning consistently world championships. During that time, consistently on the podium, winning Grand Prix. Like I said, in '99, in another era, in another universe, rather, Heinz Harald Frentzen probably would have won the Drivers' Championship. And yeah, into the early 2000s as well, continued picking up some great results and competing very well, considering the lack of resources or budget they had at times compared to other teams they were competing with. Sadly, it all fell away for Eddie, and Jordan got a lot slower and a lot poorer, and then eventually things came to an end, and the team went on to be Spiker or Midland, and then Spiker, then Force India, Racing Point, and now obviously it is Aston Martin, and great timing for Aston Martin to have their car on my screen. And I'd still say, even with the Aston Martin team, and especially the Force India team, who were quite successful in their day, it all, you in terms of who you have to thank for that, it all begins with Eddie Jordan. If he had not set up such a brilliant team who, by the way, many of those mechanics, engineers, they all, not all of them, but quite a few of them did stay over from that era going forward. If it wasn't for him putting that all together and getting such great results with them, there wouldn't be all those great moments with Force India and then Racing Point, and it would be a lot harder for Aston Martin in Formula One if the foundations had not already been laid by Eddie, 30 years ago or so. So yeah, just what a man. Easily one of the best performing team principals who actually not best performing. I think the best way to describe it is, I think if you look at, say, in the last 30 to 40 years, I think Eddie is probably one of the best team bosses of all time that never won a championship. I mean, in the last 40 years, you've had what? Toto Wolff, Christian Horner, Jean Todt, Ross Brawn, Ron Dennis, Frank Williams, Flavio Briatore. If you look outside of that group that's won championships and look at the rest of the team principals we've had in the last 30, 40 years that have never won a championship, I think he would have to be right very close, if not at the very top of team bosses that never won a championship. He was just incredible as a team principal. And as Martin Brundle said, gave so many drivers chances that other teams would not give drivers. For example, for Martin Brundle, gave him that final year on the grid in 96 when Martin was able to go out gracefully, I would say, from what was up and down Formula One career. Obviously gave debuts to many drivers. Michael Schumacher, of course, famously. Obviously, there was also other ones like Giancarlo Fisichella, Ralf Schumacher. He also gave, who else did he give a debut? Takuma Sato, who had a okay F1 career. He's had a great racing career in general, and so many very good or great racing drivers in general have raced for that team. Obviously, Damon Hill, Frentzen. Ralf Schumacher, Fisichella, Michael Schumacher. Obviously, Barrichello got his start at the team. Eddie Irvine, Nick Heidfeld. Just, so many from that era. Very good drivers. And, he gave them chances at times in particular seasons where those drivers were struggling to find people to believe in them. And he believed and gave them the chance, and a lot of the time those drivers delivered for him. So, just what a man, and he is going to be a big miss because he's been such a big part of Formula One in the last 30 years as a pundit and also a team boss. But rest in peace to Eddie Jordan, and I'm sure you guys will echo pretty much everything I've said. If you have anything you want to say about him, make sure to put it in the chat below or to the side of the stream, and I'll make sure to read out those comments at some point. But just wanted to give that tribute because it was such sad news, but I wanted to make sure I gave credit where credit is absolutely due with him, because again, what a career he had as team boss of that team and everything he did with that team. But hope you guys are well, no matter what time zone you're in, what part of the world you're from. Hope you're all having as best a time as possible. And of course, in this qualifying preview, we're going to go through pretty much what we did a week ago, which is looking at the data so far, looking at where teams in the certain sectors are quick and not so quick, and then getting into, say, my predictions for qualifying. But because we've got a sprint race coming up in a few hours, I will give my thoughts on that as to what I think likely will happen in the sprint race. So, we will get into that. Just a reminder as well, I will not be streaming for the sprint race or for qualifying tomorrow morning. I will not be doing a watch-along for those sessions. I will, though, be doing a watch-along for the race on Sunday. So don't worry, that will definitely be happening. But yeah, that we're going to go through the usual stuff pretty much, and just we'll go through an added bit on the sprint race as to what probably should happen with the sprint. But yeah, make sure as well as the stream goes along, make sure to give your thoughts as to what do you think going into the actual proper qualifying session tomorrow morning. How do you think it will play out based on what we've seen so far this weekend? And for everyone watching, of course, make sure to smash the like button. It is obviously very helpful for the channel if you could do that and help show me that you guys enjoy the content. But I think we'll get just straight into it, and let's start with the results of sprint qualifying. And this is going to be your grid for the sprint race. And Lewis Hamilton is on pole for the sprint race. Obviously had a brilliant lap in the Mercedes a year ago that was able to get him right up there on the grid. Was it pole? I think last year as well in the Mercedes for the sprint race. I think it might have been. It was an absolutely brilliant job I remember he did in the sprint last year. But again, pulling it off. Obviously, this is a track where Lewis has been so successful, and great to see in general Ferrari looking much quicker, and there is a reason for that, which I will touch on in a few moments' time, because we have found out the real reason Ferrari, in terms of their cornering, were just lacking in Melbourne compared to here, where they do appear much better than before. Max Verstappen second, and as I will point out, that was an unbelievable lap, because the Red Bull car is not really quick enough to be on the front row of the grid for a sprint race, and it definitely will not be quick enough to be on the front row for the actual race. But Max produced an unbelievable lap to get on the front row, and only 0.018 of a second away from pole. Just an incredible job by Verstappen, once again proving why he is just such an elite driver, because that Red Bull car is nowhere near as good as he's making it look. Oscar Piastri third, McLaren disappointing not to get the pole. Piastri not so much, because if you remember last year, he wasn't so great at this circuit. Hasn't got anywhere near the experience that Lando has at this track, but at least ahead of Lando on the grid, which for the championship is a plus. Charles Leclerc fourth. He'll be disappointed not to be in the top three with his teammate on pole, but at least he knows the car is a lot better this weekend, so he can at least compete there. George Russell fifth. As I will get on to, that is not a true indication of how quick Mercedes can be, because their final run in SQ3 was quicker than what they did in SQ2, but the gain of lap time they had from SQ2 to SQ3 was nowhere near as big as other teams had. Other teams had at least half a second, if not more, gain of lap time. Russell, I think, only had a couple tenths of a second. So there is more pace in that car, no doubt about it. Lando Norris sixth, absolutely terrible drive from Norris in sprint qualifying. He complained the car, he wasn't feeling comfortable in the car. I don't know how he can say that, really, given he was so quick in practice one, plus the McLaren is probably still the fastest car. So, yeah, I have no idea how Lando was able to qualify only sixth and over half a second off the pace. Easily one of the worst performances in sprint qualifying out of the whole field. Kimi Antonelli seventh. I know some people may criticize that pace, half a second off. Maybe a bit excessive, yes, but remember, Antonelli has never driven around the Shanghai International Circuit before, so he wasn't really going to be any higher than seventh anyway, realistically. Tsunoda 8th, once again, right up there for Racing Bulls. What a season he's having so far. And Racing Bulls proving that they do genuinely have a good midfield car. I still don't think it's the best midfield car. I still think that is probably the Williams. But Tsunoda proving that that Racing Bulls car is definitely quick enough to be in the mix. And Tsunoda, of course, performing at his absolute peak right now. And he'll be 8th on the grid. 9th, Alex Albon. Decent result for Williams. Could have been better, but still a decent result. And then Lance Stroll, 10th. Very good result for him, out qualifying Fernando Alonso, who, of course, has had much success here in the past. And then the rest of the field, Fernando Alonso in 11th. Aston Martin definitely have a good amount of speed. As I'll show in the sector time data, especially in the first 2 sectors, that Aston Martin car is actually pretty quick through the corners. Oliver Behrman, 12th. Haas a lot quicker here, which is good to see. And Behrman miles ahead of teammate Ocon, which is very surprising because this is Behrman's first weekend racing at this circuit when Ocon has raced here a few times. So yeah, very, very good performance by Behrman. Carlos Sainz 13th, poor performance by him. He should be really in the top 10. Bortoletto 14th, another very good qualifying performance from him. Ahead of Hulkenberg. Obviously doesn't count to the overall qualifying head-to-head, but still ahead of Hulkenberg. Isaac Hadjar 15th. Will admit, I don't know why he didn't do a lap time, but yeah, 15th is not the end of the world, but given how quick the Racing Bulls car is, he probably should be at least P12-ish. I think that's probably where he would have been if he did an actual time in SQ2. And then Jack Doohan 16th, Gasly 17th, Ocon 18th, Hulkenberg 19th, and Liam Lawson 20th and last. He is getting replaced very soon. I'm just calling it now. It's going to happen. I think at the latest by Imola, but I reckon even by the Bahrain Grand Prix, where Red Bull have said they're going to bring their big upgrade they hope will put them on the pace of McLaren. Even by then, I can see Lawson out of that car. And maybe the return of Sergio Perez. We'll have to see. But yeah, wow. How bad has Liam Lawson been so far? He's making Perez and Perez's career at Red Bull look like Senna in the McLaren. It is quite incredible. I didn't think Lawson could be as bad as he was in Melbourne, at least pace-wise. And no, he's even worse. Wow. And had some off-track moments I saw, I think, in practice 1 as well. So yeah, complete disaster there for Lawson. But yeah, that is the sprint qualifying grid. Now, let me just go through the sector time data, and then we will get on to, before my final qualifying prediction, I will get on to my sprint race prediction also, and I'll just give my thoughts on that. But let's go through the sector time data first, just to understand why certain teams are quick in certain areas, and also just why it ended up in sprint qualifying the way it did. So the first sector is really all about slow corners, and McLaren nearly a quarter of a second quicker than any other team. Absolutely incredible pace in Sector 1, which is not a surprise. That McLaren car, the aero, the chassis, all of it is just so, so good. So maybe a tad surprising, you could argue, that they're that far ahead in just the first sector, but yeah, it is just such a good car. And then, second best, Aston Martin. I mean, I know a couple years ago, this car was pretty good in slow corners. And I remember last year at the Chinese Grand Prix, obviously Fernando Alonso could have had a podium and was having a really competitive weekend. But yeah, Aston Martin, very strong in Sector 1 and with Lance Stroll. So potentially even more pace in that car. We'll have to see once we get to qualifying. But yeah, very, very impressed by the pace of the Aston Martin there. Ferrari, then a quarter of a second off. I think the first sector is definitely the weakest part of the track for Ferrari compared to McLaren. In the other parts, they are at least closer, if not maybe quicker, if you want to argue, in other parts of the track. But the first sector is the weakest part for them. But thankfully for Ferrari, it gets better going forward. And then Red Bull slightly slower, Mercedes slightly slower. So Ferrari, Red Bull, Mercedes all on basically the same pace in the first sector, but all three collectively miles behind McLaren. Williams, pretty good first sector speed. Racing Bulls, okay. And then a bit of a drop off of a couple tenths to Haas, then Sauber, and then Alpine. The first sector for Haas, not very good, but the rest of the lap, as you'll see, is actually quite decent for Haas and looking a lot better this weekend in terms of their grip and just the data for them. The middle sector is the most, I'd say, aerocentric part of the track in terms of that this is the part of the track where your aerodynamic grip is the most important. And Ferrari, the quickest through this part of the lap, just over half a tenth quicker than the McLaren and Piastri. Lando Norris was, I think, what was it, a tenth? Was it a tenth? I think about a tenth, maybe a tenth and a half slower than Norris in the first sector, in the second sector, sorry. So maybe McLaren could have done a middle sector speed better than what they overall did, but still, Ferrari aerodynamically looking good. It's just that slow speed corner performance which is lacking compared to McLaren. But in the high speed corners, they look very good. So that is a good thing to see for Ferrari. And it has been revealed why they were having such issues in Melbourne. And basically, let me just quickly find it on my end. So Ferrari were plank limited in Melbourne. And you may be asking, what does that mean? Basically, after Friday practice, they had to raise the floor of the car slightly higher than they would have wanted to save the plank from being absolutely, battered and destroyed. And that obviously affected their speed. Obviously, with these ground effect era cars, the closer you run to the ground, the more downforce you're going to have and the quickest. So if you're having to raise your car even slightly, that is really going to hurt. And that is why Ferrari in Melbourne were a bit extra slow, let's say, compared to what maybe their potential was, because they had to raise the car to save the car, the plank, from just getting the abuse that it would have got. So that's why Ferrari are here in Shanghai showing a lot more of what they actually have in terms of the car's potential. And the potential is still, I don't think, as good as McLaren, but it's probably the second best car on the grid. That's what I would say, at least for qualifying trim. So, and that's what we thought their pace would be going into the first Grand Prix, but it just didn't turn out to be that way. So yeah, Ferrari showing a lot more pace, still not the overall best team, but they're not as far off as we thought they were, which is really encouraging because I did not have a good feeling after the first Grand Prix last week. Anyway, Red Bull, 10th of a second off Ferrari. Actually, a bit closer Red Bull through the middle sector than I was probably expecting. Mercedes, I don't think really could be that much better in the middle sector, to be honest. So I think their speed's okay. But then, not too far back, Aston Martin, a full quarter of a second behind Ferrari. And yeah, first and second sector, very good pace for Aston Martin. And as you'll see in a moment, the reason they're only 10th and 11th for the sprint race is because of the final sector, which surely points to them having just nowhere near enough straight line speed down that long 1 kilometer back straight we have at the Shanghai circuit. Racing Bulls, good speed, showing really what they had in Melbourne. Very good grip there. Haas, though, much more encouraging compared to what we saw in Melbourne, where they were just miles off the pace. Williams, not too great, I have to say, but still close enough to those other midfield teams. Sauber, not great. And then Alpine, I have no idea why they're so slow this weekend. I don't know if, it's kind of like what happened on Friday last week in Melbourne, where it's a setup problem. but they are so much slower than I expected them to be here. I thought they could have been maybe the quickest midfield team this weekend coming into this Grand Prix, but yeah, they look like one of the slowest, so can't really explain that, if I'm honest, at the moment. And then the final sector, obviously got a couple corners which are important. The corner right before that 1 kilometre straight is very important, getting a good release onto the straight. Then you've got the hairpin at the end of the straight, and then a quick left-hander that takes you, obviously, to the start-finish line. Red Bull and McLaren pretty much equal in the final sector. Ferrari a tenth or so, a tenth of a second back compared to those two teams. Mercedes a couple tenths off. I think Mercedes probably could find, say, a tenth of a second more in the final sector, definitely, compared to McLaren. Bit too far off in the final sector for my liking. Williams, though, much, much better in the final sector. Clearly the best midfield team by about a couple tenths of a second ahead of Racing Bulls. And then Aston Martin. So with Aston Martin, if they can just be somehow a quarter of a second faster in this final sector, then I think they would pretty easily have the fastest midfield car. But clearly lacking maybe 4 or 5 kilometers an hour in a straight line, which is really affecting them. So may have to adjust the setup. I mean, it still will work well for them in the race or in the sprint race if they have maybe a tad more wing on the setup than maybe they would have gone for normally. You know, obviously that helped with the tyres and all of that, but it's costing them in qualifying and not really showcasing their genuine speed. So Aston Martin definitely can find a bit more, maybe with a slight setup alteration. Haas, not great, but a lot better than last week, at least. Alpine and Sauber then at the very back. But overall, we'll go back to the top 10, and this again will be your top 10 starting grid for the sprint race, which I think the sprint race starts in about 6 hours, 6.5 hours from now. In terms of the pecking order from sprint qualifying and the pecking order that I believe it is going into qualifying tomorrow morning, I still think McLaren have got the best car. Lando can do a lot better. There's no doubt about it. But the gap between them and the rest, at least in qualifying trim, is not as big as I expected it to be. I'd say McLaren are about 2, maybe 3 tenths of a second at most ahead of the next best car. So McLaren have still got the car to beat. If you're going to beat them, though, you've just got to hope for what happened in sprint qualifying, the drivers not getting the job done. But McLaren, I'm pretty sure, have got the best car still. Second quickest, in quali trim, I would say Ferrari. Very close behind, though, I would say Mercedes. I think they are not very far behind Ferrari at all. I mean, if you look back at the sector time data, in Sector 1, only a few hundredths slower than Ferrari. Second sector, 10th.5 behind. That's really where the difference is being, or was being made in sprint qualifying between the two. And then the final sector, only a 10th of a second. So there isn't, let me go back. There you go. There isn't a lot separating those two teams. And again, Russell did not do in SQ3 as strong of a lap, I think, as he could have done. So I think Mercedes, I'm going to say in quali trim, a third quickest, but slightly. And when I mean slightly, I'm talking maybe a few hundredths or maybe a tenth of a second slower than Ferrari. That's what I believe. And then Red Bull, I think in quali trim, have the fourth best car, which is why I was saying what an incredible job it was that Max put it on the front row for the sprint race, because that Red Bull car is not at that level right now. And then after that, I would say Williams 5th, Aston Martin very close behind 6th, 7th, Racing Bulls, and then Haas, Alpine, and Sauber rounding out the rest of the field. That's what I believe in quali trim the pecking order is. For the sprint race, though, obviously a bit more fuel on board. It's going to be... Alex Albon actually said it after qualifying, or sprint qualifying. He said it was going to be a boring sprint race because it was just going to be a tyre management exercise, which is likely. It is going to be pretty hot, I think, for the sprint. And the tyres, obviously, get a killing around this Shanghai circuit. Yeah, they get absolutely destroyed to the front tyres. So, very possible that could be the case. And I think, even though McLaren are third and sixth on the grid, definitely does play into their hands, because we saw it in Melbourne. Their tyre management and tyre wear in general a lot better than the other front-running teams. Also, tyre management not too bad for Mercedes, and it's not the worst for Red Bull. Ferrari, though, I am very interested to see how they manage their tyres, especially if it is a hot sprint race taking place in, the middle of the afternoon. So we will see. But if I was to predict what will happen in the sprint race, I think a lot of it is going to come down to the start. For example, if Verstappen gets into the lead at the start, I think he probably just about hangs on to win. But if Hamilton hangs on to the lead, then doesn't necessarily mean Hamilton will win, because I think it does depend on then who is in second. If it's Piastri, that is bad news for Ferrari, because I think Piastri will probably go on to beat Hamilton, purely because the McLaren has quite a bit extra race pace compared to the Ferrari. So if Hamilton is going to win the sprint race, he really needs Max or Leclerc, his teammate, to be in second. If it's Piastri, it's going to be a really tough job for him to finish P1 for the sprint race, which of course 8 points are available for the sprint race win. My prediction is, I think Max Verstappen will win the sprint race. Second, I'm going Oscar Piastri. Third, Hamilton. Fourth, I am going to go with Leclerc. And then fifth, Russell. Sixth, Norris. Seventh, Antonelli. And eighth, I will go with Tsunoda. So yeah, that's what I think will happen for the sprint race. And for Max Verstappen, if Lando Norris does finish, say, fifth or sixth, or let's say it ends up exactly the way I predicted it, Max would gain 5 points on Lando. And remember, Lando, I know we've only had one Grand Prix, but Lando leads the championship over Verstappen by 7 points. So Max would cut the gap down to just 2 points going into Sunday's race. The reason that's important is because McLaren are going to start the season with a faster car. Max needs to make sure he keeps that gap not too big, so that when the Red Bull car gets good enough, he can then really get after Lando in the championship. So if Max can win the sprint race, even if Lando was to finish in second, it's still a gain in the championships, and it really would be important for Verstappen. But yeah, that's what I think the top 8 will be in the sprint. Verstappen to win, Piastri second, and then Hamilton, Leclerc, Russell, Norris, Antonelli, Tsunoda. For qualifying, though, because this is a qualifying preview, let's get into my predicted top 10 for qualifying tomorrow morning. And on pole position, it will be Lando Norris. I think this time, maybe with a slight setup change, he will deliver, and he will, by a couple tenths of a second, put it on pole for McLaren. Second, I am going to go Lewis Hamilton, the Ferrari, who is clearly having a good weekend, plus that Ferrari in quali trim looks pretty good. Piastri, I'm going to go in third. I think Hamilton can definitely get ahead of Piastri in qualifying. Russell, then, I'm going in fourth. I think he will, and Mercedes will show the real potential of that car in qualifying and get himself a good grid position. Leclerc, then, I think will be in fifth. Max, Yes, surprising. I'm going with him in 6th, and then 7th Antonelli, 8th Albon, 9th Alonso, and 10th Carlos Sainz. That's my predicted top 10 for qualifying in China. And let's hope both the sprint and the qualifying session are exciting. Like I said, I won't be covering the sprint race or qualifying on the channel, but I will be covering the race on Sunday. And just a reminder, I will be going live 2 hours before lights out in Shanghai at 5 a.m. UK time for the 2-hour build-up. The race obviously starting at 7 a.m. here in the UK. And I will be joined by my co-commentator Niblo, who of course attended last week's Grand Prix in Melbourne. So, yeah, that's the plan for Sunday. And then, of course, on Monday, there will be a podcast reviewing the Chinese Grand Prix weekend. But before I go into your comments, guys, just a few more things I just want to get into. And that is some stats regarding the top teams going into qualifying. Just a reminder of, I guess, the success of certain teams in years past here in Shanghai. And we'll start with McLaren. Their last pole position in China was in 2008. I was going to say 16 years ago. No, 17 years ago. That was their last pole in Shanghai. Unbelievable it's been that long. McLaren as well have only taken pole twice in Shanghai since the first Chinese Grand Prix, which was 21 years ago in 2004. Those two poles being taken by, you guessed it, Lewis Hamilton. Obviously 2007 he got pole, and then infamously got stuck in the gravel at the start of the pit lane. 2008 though, he smashed the field and won in what was a key win in leading on to him eventually just about winning his first world championship. McLaren last year qualified 4th and 5th here. Obviously had a much better race with Lando, but McLaren a lot better or a lot quicker this year at this point of time this year than they were a year ago. Red Bull took pole, of course, at last year's Chinese Grand Prix with Max Verstappen. Red Bull, though, only taken pole once in Shanghai in the last 10 years. Not been very successful, this track for them in qualifying. Last year, though, it was very successful. They locked out the front row, and this was probably the most dominant Grand Prix Red Bull had before the other teams caught up, I think, after the Miami Grand Prix in 2024. So, yeah, Red Bull are going to have to do something special to replicate that weekend of last year. For Ferrari, their last pole in China was 7 years ago in 2018 with Sebastian Vettel. Locked out the front row that weekend. Somehow, though, I don't think they even got on the podium. Or actually, did they get on the podium? Yes, they did. Raikkonen got on the podium, but I think they ended up 3rd and 8th for that race. It was an absolute disaster class by the Scuderia that day. And that pole position is their only pole in the last 10 years. So similar to Red Bull, not very successful in the last decade in qualifying here in Shanghai. And last year, they were only 6th and 7th on the grid. They had a better race. They ended up 4th and 5th in the race. But yeah, it was one of the worst qualifying sessions they had last year. They will definitely be better in the qualifying session tomorrow. And then finally for Mercedes, their last pole in China was in 2019 with Valtteri Bottas, a weekend where they locked out the front row and got a 1-2. Mercedes, though, in the last decade, obviously have been the most successful at this track. 4 pole positions in the last 10 years. But they will also have a much better qualifying and grid position for this race than they did a year ago. A year ago, I think we must forget just how bad they were this time last year. They were 8th and 18th in qualifying at the Chinese Grand Prix last year. Impressively, though, I think they ended up 5th and 9th in the race. So they did pretty well in the race to recover decent points. But yeah, they were so bad a year ago. Again, it's quite shocking to look back to then and just see how bad they were. And yeah, looking a lot more competitive at this point. But those are all the stats and the data and all of that stuff that I wanted to go through. It's now time, as hello to Nib in the chat, good to see you, mate. Let's go through some of your comments in the chat before we come to the end of this stream. Make sure to smash the like button, by the way, if you haven't already. And if you are new to the channel, of course, don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. KH says Lewis hopefully will win this Grand Prix. Tom says the tobacco ban really ruined Jordan. Yeah, it didn't help at that particular time. See what I see. Sorry, says if you gave Eddie Jordan a big budget back then, he easily win a championship. No doubt. He definitely would. He could have easily won a couple of championships back then. He was doing the absolute maximum of what he could have done with that team. And back then, there wasn't many people that were doing that. Only really, Ron Dennis, Frank Williams, eventually Jean Todt with Ferrari. But other than those three, there wasn't really anyone else who was getting the maximum from the entire team and able to deliver such great results consistently. I think it's I in the chat says Norris made a mistake in sector 3. He went wide and just kept it on track. Yeah, at the hairpin, went deep, lost himself a lot of time. But even if he had kept it on the track and had the best hairpin possible, I'm still not sure he would have actually put it on pole, because his middle sector was really not that good. So it would have still been close. And that's, again, disappointing. Lando should be easily getting the sprint pole. I know, yeah, the McLaren, it's not absolutely miles clear of everyone, but it's still the best car. So 6th on the grid for the sprint is shockingly poor, I'm afraid. Simon Volye, I think it is, says Williams have failed the rear wing flexibility test. I did see earlier that Williams failed to provide onboard footage of their rear wing camera on time, and that they were summoned to the stewards because of that, but I haven't seen anything about them having actually failed that test. They were the only thing they're guilty of that I can see is that they failed to they failed to supply the footage that the FIA said that all the teams, I think, had to by the end of practice 1 or an hour after practice 1, something like that. Dartford Raven says, hey Chaz, good to see you. Good to see you too. Definitely great to see Ferrari, McLaren, Red Bull fight this weekend. We can say Perez wasn't too bad. If you see Lawson right now struggling even more, really being the last car of all, he will be replaced again very soon. Even though there is talk that Sergio Perez is going to be racing for Cadillac F1 next year, who thankfully will be a new team on the grid next year and the 11th team on the grid. I wouldn't be surprised if Perez replaces Lawson after a few races and completes the rest of the year for Red Bull on a, like a rolling contract, basically. And then maybe for 2026, Perez does go to Cadillac and Red Bull, I don't know, put maybe finally Tsunoda in that car. We'll see. But, yeah. Let's give Liam another, 2 to 3 Grand Prix. And we will see what he can do, but it is not looking good for Lawson. Actually, I'm not going to say another 2 to 3 Grand Prix. I'd say if by the end of the Japanese Grand Prix weekend, which is in a couple of weeks from now, if he's still this bad, then I think even by then, I think you'd have to just get rid I know people would say, oh, but only 3 race weekends, that's not enough time. If he's this bad after the first 3 races, even if he improves, it's not going to be by the drastic amount he needs to improve by. So no, he has to step it up. And if you're, looking at the pecking order, Red Bull, yeah, they've not got the quickest car, no doubt about that. They've got, maybe you could argue, the 3rd best car at best. I think, honestly, in quali trim, it's probably the 4th best. And they're not miles ahead of the midfield, Red Bull. So yeah, I'm not expecting Lawson to be, 3rd row of the grid or anything. But at worst, he should be getting into like Q2. At worst. He, knocked out in Q1 or SQ1, whatever you want to call it, is unacceptable. The Red Bull car is not that bad, not to that point. And I mean, if we go back and look at the top 10 from sprint qualifying, Lawson really should be, I would say, given Antonelli did quite a slow SQ3 lap, I'd say Lawson should be in between that, in between that gap between Norris and Antonelli, so 7th on the grid, which again is not great, but given how quick Max was, that would be fair enough to be in 7th place. And at that point, given the lack of pace Red Bull still have in certain areas, you wouldn't really be able to sit here and go, oh, well, Lawson should be miles better, because the car is actually not that great right now. So, yeah. But, again, at the absolute worst, he should be getting into Q2. Q1 eliminations is just, it's taking the piss, really. Sarah Garza says, Ferrari potentially fastest. I don't know. There's decent odds, though, on Norris to win the sprint. I would be amazed if Lando wins the sprint for 2 reasons. One, Piastri, his teammates ahead of him on the grid. So if a McLaren's going to win the sprint, it should be Oscar. But secondly, I don't think Lando is going to make up that many positions, especially with how hard it is to follow around this track. And McLaren are not that far ahead of the others to the point where they can still easily pass the others, despite the dirty air effect. So, yeah. Lando, I don't see him in the top 3. Again, if McLaren are going to win the sprint, it's going to be with Oscar, who definitely can win the sprint, but like I said earlier, it really comes down with Oscar to the start. He needs to be at least, I think, 2nd at the end of lap 1. And if he is, game on. He can absolutely then win the sprint and take a few points off his teammate. And as well with Oscar, if he is going to win the championship, which is definitely a possibility, he is in the fastest car for the moment. When Lando makes mistakes like he's made so far this weekend, that's where Oscar needs to, make the difference. And at least in qualifying or the race, just make sure he's ahead of Lando. Doesn't necessarily have to be on pole, absolutely, but just making sure he at least takes advantage. And so far, he's done that, and maybe can take full advantage in the sprint race. Nib saying Oscar wins the sprint, no doubt in my mind. I'd say it's a 50-50, honestly, but yeah. And also Nib saying Lewis did a great lap, no doubt, but sprint quali is inherently a bit mickey compared to normal quali. True, but if you look at most qualifying sessions, after a sprint qualifying, most of them tend to be a bit similar to what happens in sprint quali. Not exactly the same, but yeah, it tends to mostly, the trend that starts in sprint quali tends to mostly continue. Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see who wins the sprint tomorrow. I think the only 3 drivers that can win the sprint is Hamilton, Verstappen, or Piastri. The start of the race, again, very, very crucial in determining who is going to win the sprint. And even though the sprint is not absolutely crucial, there is, only a few points on offer. It still may come down, the championship, for example, to a few points in Abu Dhabi in the first week of December. Dorsal Rim says, I agree, at least top 7 for Lawson, but analyse his driving. He can't handle the car, and I don't think it's only the setup of the car, but I think Tsunoda should have been given a chance. Absolutely, I agree. Tsunoda should have been given a chance. And yeah, in Melbourne, you could see it especially. Liam just couldn't control the car at all. He went off about, 2 or 3 times just in Q1. It was a shocking performance. If he had kept it all together and done the best lap he could have done and still ended up in getting knocked out in Q1, then that would be a lot worse, because then, if that's potentially the best he could do, then that really is very poor. But I think once Liam is able to get the car consistently under control, which is all down to him, then there should be more potential in there, surely. But at least for Liam, he still has, the proper qualifying and race still to come. So a chance to reset, and maybe he'll actually deliver this time. We will see. But that's pretty much it, guys, for this qualifying preview. Thanks for coming along for this one. And let me just finish up the poll in the chat. Thank you guys for voting. And I asked you guys who will take pole position for the Chinese Grand Prix. And 48% of you, out of 64 votes, have gone for Lewis Hamilton, which I'm quite surprised by. 28% for Lando Norris, 14% for Max, 9% for Piastri. It would be quite incredible if Hamilton got pole for the actual race as well. But again, I'd be very surprised by that, as long as both McLaren drivers get their laps nailed in qualifying. But reminder, again, I will not be doing a watch along for the sprint race or for qualifying tomorrow morning, but I will be live for the race with Niblo at 5 a.m. UK time, 2 hours before the race begins, for the 7 a.m. UK start, when we will be doing, obviously, the usual build-up to the race, and then taking you through the events of the 56 laps in Shanghai. And then, obviously, we will see what comes of it. I still think McLaren are the heavy favourites this weekend. I would be very surprised if McLaren do not end up with pole and the win. Maybe they won't get the front row if a Hamilton or a Verstappen does pull out a special lap. But, yeah, it's going to take something quite special, I still think, for McLaren not to end up winning the weekend. But we will see. You just never know what can happen. I mean, look at last week in Melbourne. McLaren should have easily won that race, and they very almost easily lost the Grand Prix in the end. I know Norris had a slightly broken floor, but still, it really came down to very fine margins in the end, and it can do this weekend. We've seen it before. So, yeah, looking forward to qualifying. I'll make sure to watch it live, and I'll make sure to make sure that I'm awake enough so that I can enjoy the session as well. And hopefully you guys can enjoy the session. But like I said, make sure to join us on Sunday morning for the race watch along here on the channel. This qualifying preview, by the way, will continue at the next Grand Prix in Japan, because in Japan also I will not be doing a qualifying watch along, but will be doing a race watch along. So the qualifying preview will be back in 2 weeks' time, the night before qualifying at Suzuka. So make sure to join us for that as well. But guys, until the Grand Prix on Sunday here on the channel, hopefully you can join us for that. And hopefully you enjoy qualifying tomorrow morning in Shanghai, a qualifying session that should be very close and competitive through the field. Until then, guys, it has been me, Kazza HD. Goodbye.